Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to have on the line with us this evening Mr. Alan Porter of Pedigree Consultants and TrueNicks, the man who brought us our last two Breeders' Cup winners, Arrogate and Gunrunner. How are you doing tonight, Mr. Porter?
Hi, pleased to be with you tonight.
Thank you. And, you and I were talking a little bit on the phone earlier about, how you got started in the business or the science of pedigree planning. Could you go into a little bit more detail and tell our listeners about how you got your start?
Yeah. I mean, from my personal experience, I've been interested in pedigrees probably the better part of 45 years, and started working off on a horse farm, and then went to work for a racing magazine in England, Pacemaker. And so I've been writing about breeding since the mid-'70s, and then worked for Bert Firestone, who people will probably remember through Genuine Risk, particularly, I imagine. Had a lot of other good horses like Foolish Pleasure and Honest Pleasure and those kind of horses, Fanfreluche. Started doing matings for them, so probably over 30 years ago. And I always had a little bit of initially wanting to, what makes a horse fast, and then starting to look in some ways of less traditional things. When I first became involved, we were still doing things the same way that Federico Tessio had been doing matings in the early 1900s. Nothing really much had changed in terms of looking at pedigrees, and because at that stage nothing was really known about genetics and performance, a lot of theories could be floated out. It was very hard to gainsay them or disprove them. And, pedigrees and matings were done with what they called split pedigree books. They had a pedigree of the stallion at the top and a pedigree of the mare at the bottom, and we'd turn the pages and look at them. There was no, and people were aware of nicks in terms of, they knew very obvious crosses that had been successful. Anecdotally, they had known that, well, this often works with this, but there was no scientific exploration of it. And even back when I was 18, which is longer ago than I'd like to remember, I'd had the idea that, you would like to look at nicks and pedigrees statistically, but there just wasn't the possibility of doing that at the time. I mean, we used to work with Weatherby's, who are the English equivalent of the Jockey Club. That they were building a database at the time, but all the results were kept manually and checked manually, and there was just no way to interrogate a database. The computing power didn't exist. And I mean, even when Byron Rogers and I were talking about doing TrueNicks about 12 years ago, there's a book published about that time says this would be the ideal way of doing nicking, but because of the lack of databases and the lack of computing power, it's not possible. And so we were probably just on the cutting edge with that. But I would say, in my experience in the breeding industry, that it's probably changed more in the last somewhere between 15 and 10 years than it had in probably the previous 80 or maybe 100. There really hadn't been any radical changes in terms of how you looked at pedigrees and how matings were done for probably more than a century.
It's a double-edged sword, because while you can get a statistical analysis on any mating nowadays, sometimes it can be a little bit oversimplified.
It can. One of the hardest things with the thoroughbred is the kind of trade-off between getting enough numbers to make it statistically significant and precision, that specific mating. It's not often that a single stallion with a single broodmare is tried often enough that you can say that that's statistically significant. So that leads you to kind of extrapolate, which you go back more generations, and there is a tendency when you go back more generations, it's a little less accurate to a degree. Now, I think there are reasons why following the male line, it's not a question of inheriting specific genes. It's a question of where the quality in a pedigree resides. So male line crosses do continue to be broadly reflective over several generations. We established that for ourselves statistically. But, TrueNicks is a good, ready reckoner. And I mean, I would say that statistics like that, they are a good servant, they're a bad master.
I ask this as somebody who has owned brood mares and, requested a certain stallion for my mare and had the mare, without any other consideration from the stallion owner, rejected based on a bad nick rating. What would you say? Now, the mare also was basically a perfect inside-out equivalent to the stallion in terms of the bloodlines. But what would you say to a stallion owner who would, boil everything down to a sire line nick and reject a mating?
I do a lot of work for stallion owners. When the horse is going off to stud, and my view is, and what I always tell them is, we think we know what might work the most, and what might be the strongest strains, but we want to test everything, because there's going to be a point where a sire line will somewhat change course, for want of a better word. I think we see this, for instance, with a little bit with Tappet and Bernardini, particularly perhaps as broodmare sires we're going to see. They might not act exactly like AP Indian General has acted because of the influence of the Fapiano line on both of their dams. So, I mean, if I had a mare, if I was standing a stallion, and I mean, I can tell you, and I won't name names to save embarrassment, but one of the world's best breeders I had planned the mating. They wanted to send a mare to a Kentucky stallion, and the manager of that stallion said, "No, you can't send that mare because I don't like the mating." Well, 5 years down the line, they'd forgotten about that, and I put up the same mating for another breeder, and we got a horse that won 3 Grade 1s. So, I mean, I think if the mare is qualified in terms of commerciality, and it's not a ridiculous thing where somebody's breeding a cheap mare, wants to breed to $100,000 stallion. You have to give the breeder some license. You can't determine just on one metric that mare's not going to produce a good horse. Yeah, do I want to have a lot of mares by stallions that are proven to be a bad cross for that sire? No. But in the context of trying that stallion out and taking a chance on some things where the nick isn't high but the pattern is good, I can tell you that I planned the mating for Goldikova, and her nick at the time was a D. But we'd noticed that even though Annabah hadn't done well with Blushing Groom in general, he'd done well with a horse called Groom Dancer, who was a Blushing Groom Leafard cross, and a couple of mares that were Blushing Groom Leafard. And Goldikova's dam was Blushing Groom Leafard. And so when you had that combination instead of just the Blushing Groom, it worked very well. So nicks, as I say, they're a good broad guide. And we supply statistics with them. And for instance, I'll give you an example that we come across in Australia, where you'd expect Artie Schiller as a Sadler's Well line horse, with some of the other things he has in his pedigree, to do very well with Danehill. And there's been 50-something foals on the cross, I think, the last time I looked, and I think no stakes winners, or 1 stakes winner. So there's an example where it's been tried and really found wanting. And I think that's useful information to have. I think I probably wouldn't send my Danehill line mare to Artie Schiller, however clever the pattern was, because that's almost established as an anti-affinity. But, you do have to have some license for breeders who are making some intelligent decisions and who know their own mare to do 1 or 2 things a little different.
Right. I mean, I think it would be unfortunate for a stallion to miss out on a potential test of an opportunity.
Absolutely. This is the same. This is what I stress. Is that if you're starting off with a new stallion, yes, you emphasize the crosses we think historically are most likely to work, either from a nicking or pattern perspective. But you have to let the world at large test other things. Maybe they like it from a conformation and aptitude background. Things like that. And there's other things. The Nick doesn't take into account, a Galileo with a Danehill mare or a Danehill line mare is going to give you a very high Nick. But if that Danehill line mare happened to be one that excelled over 2 miles, and there are some, then when you send it to Galileo, if you're lucky, you're going to get a good stayer, and if you're unlucky, you're going to get a plotter that's struggling to win a race.
Correct. Well, another topic you and I had talked about earlier was the idea of the passing of the baton from the early breeders like Tessio and Marcel Boussac. Do you want to go ahead and expand on that theory?
Yeah, by all means. I think that there is an old book called Stud Book Lore, Lore, and was written by the father of a lady called Florence Pryor. She probably name doesn't mean much here unless you're a real historian, but she did a lot about establishing the early foundations of the thoroughbred, and also wrote the half-bred stud book. And her father knew. I actually met her when she was in her late 80s, probably. I mean, she'd seen Mumtaz Mahal run at Royal Ascot. And her father, knew breeders back into the mid-1800s. And I think that breeders were largely, some very smart breeders were often trying to do somewhat similar things. And I almost think there is a chain of knowledge that where Tessio certainly knew Lord Derby, whose stud manager was an extremely clever breeder. Olin Gentry, who did the matings for Idle Hour Farm and later for Derby Dan, he went to Europe and met those people and knew them. The Aga Khan's breeding management, they all knew each other. And I think there's almost a chain of knowledge that was passed on and some thinking about pedigrees and matings. Because you can certainly look at, say, Tessio's matings and have a fair idea in many cases of what he was trying to do. Right.
Exactly. And I know that, when I first started studying pedigrees intensely, I came across a lot of Les Brinsfield's printed work, and it was clear that he had many communications with Olin Gentry, and that Olin Gentry had passed down knowledge to him as well. And part of the reason I've done my show here is to revive some of the knowledge that was posted online but has since been taken down, and to keep those perspectives alive, and so that people don't get just wrapped up into a bunch of data and make decisions based solely on data.
And I think, too, what happens is interesting that can ebb and flow. When the business is at a commercial peak, people become more interested in commercial matings and probably take less care when they feel they may have to breed for themselves. And this is a generalization, but I think the interest in pedigree and things like that increases. So it does ebb and flow. And as I say, things like nicking programs, I mean, there was the work nicks and ours are probably a double-edged sword. I mean, they are extremely useful. We have a lot of data with them, but they do tend to simplify things or perhaps oversimplify things. And unfortunately, I believe culturally, we're in an era that particularly likes simple solutions and tends not to have the patience for subtleties. By and large, that's not to say every single person, but culturally, I think we have reached that little point a little bit.
Yeah,
but it is so.
I was going to say, I think one of the most overlooked pieces of technology that TrueNicks offers is the Key Ancestors Report.
Yes,
and where it really considers the whole pedigree, finds out who the positive ancestors are, who the negative ancestors are, and I would like you to kind of shed a little more light on that and how you use it in your daily planning.
Well, we started it. I had a client approach many years ago when the last couple of crops of Danehill were coming through the sales in Australia, and he wanted a more sophisticated way of looking at them than just looking at the nicks. And so what I did, I got the whole pedigree of all the Danehills and divided them into broadly kind of good and bad camps, at least mares that had thrown a good one and mares that hadn't thrown a good one. I think I had you were either a graded stakes winner or a grade 2 place, something like that. And so we had superior